A few housekeeping items I'd like to go over for all of you. As you've noticed that you've been trying to speak, but nobody can hear you, and that is because you have been muted. And the reason that we are asking everyone to stay muted during the presentation is so that the presenters and as well as the participants aren't interrupted by background noises, etc., or telephones ringing, etc. So everyone is asked to be muted. This means that you're not able to ask a verbal question, but we all have the chat functionality on our Zoom. So I'm assuming that we're pretty all used to Zoom at this point in time, but if you've never used the chat functionality, if you look at the bottom of your screen in the black outside your screen, there is a little thing that says chat. If you click on that, you will be able to ask a question, and it should go directly to me privately. It will come to me privately, and I will ask questions of our presenters. That way we won't have a lot of people trying to ask questions because we just have too many people on this Zoom. So please use the chat functionality to ask all of your questions. The third thing I wanted to mention is that this is being recorded and it will be on our Garden Club website. And if anybody would like to get a copy of the recording, please contact Linda Schaefer, who will be able to send you, who is doing the recording, and she will be able to send it to you. And we also, the West Newbury Cable Company has expressed interest, and it will be aired at some time, we don't know exactly when, on the West Newbury cable station. And we don't know exactly what time or when that will be, but information will be found on the West Newbury Town website. So that's really all the housekeeping. I don't need to tell you where the restrooms are. I'm sure we all know at our own home. So with that, I would like to introduce our presenters. Tonight we have Nancy Powell. Nancy, you want to wave so everyone can see you? And Carol Decker. Carol. And Nancy is a wildlife biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on Plum Island. She is a member of the West Newbury Garden Club, and she lives here in town with her husband and 2 boys. What she loves about living in West Newbury is walking the trails and the roads and enjoying what she considers to be the native aspect of West Newbury. She's excited to bring her professional experience with invasive plants and restoring native habitats to the hometown of West Newbury to make it wild and wonderful. Carol is also a resident of West Newbury, and she is the former sanctuary director at Mass Audubon's Ipswich River Wildlife Sanctuary, and serves now as a member of West Newbury's open space committees. She has been removing invasive plants from her property, planting native, and looks forward to establishing management plans for our town's conservation lands. So at this point, I am going to turn the presentation over to Nancy and Carol.
Okay, I am going to be sharing my screen. Okay. Can everyone see the slides? I guess Jane will let us know if you cannot.
Yeah, if you can't, send me a chat and I'll let them know. So if anybody's having trouble seeing the slide that Nancy has put up, let us know. Let me know.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Jane, for the introduction and the club for hosting this presentation. So Carol and I are part of a new working group that's developing in town. It initially started as trying to control invasive, and very quickly we got into the reason why we care about invasives, which is restoring natives and pollinator gardens and all the types of gardens that we do want in town and in our backyards. So there, right now the club is, the committee, the working group is relatively new. It's only about 2 months, and we have about 15 members, some of which are Garden Club members. And Linda Schaefer, who joined our committee a while back, suggested that we give a presentation to the Garden Club. And I also appreciate the Garden Club opening up to the wider community. And one nice thing about Zoom is that, you know, we can accommodate all these people. So Carol and I are going to tag team on this presentation. We're going to try to introduce a little bit about invasives and terms that are used. We're going to talk about the 12 invasives in town, which Carol will tell you was not easy to get down to 12. We've affectionately called it the West Newbury 30 dozen. And then we'll kind of split up and talk a little bit about how you identify them, how you control them, and some native alternatives to some of them. And then I will wrap up by talking about some of the ideas that the working group is coming up with, and we're looking for more help. We're looking for input from you guys. So I'll be, at the end of the presentation, we'll definitely want to get some input from you. And we want this to be informal. So even though you are muted, please feel free to send a chat in to Jane if you do have any questions for me or Carol. And we're hoping to have lots of time after the presentation for a question and answer session. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Carol.
Great, thanks, Nancy, and happy to be here tonight. It's such an important topic for our community. So just a little bit on my background. I spent many years as a director at the Ipswich River Wildlife Sanctuary in Topsfield. And prior to it becoming a Mass Audubon sanctuary in 1950, it was the estate of a businessman and horticulturist, Thomas Proctor. He purchased it in 1898, and he had this goal of transforming it and this land almost eventually, it was around 1,000 acres that he transformed. And he wanted it to become an arboretum. And in his day, he was very successful. It rivaled the Arnold Arboretum in Boston. So during 50 years, he introduced over 3,000 plants from North America, Asia, and Europe. Asia and Europe were at the same latitude. So these are plants that could survive what were then our harsh winters. Many of those plants stayed where they were planted, and many did not. So for myself, it was really revealing to see how these non-natives in many cases became, such a threat to the ecosystems, and also the time, the amount of time and the money it takes to eradicate or manage them. So we're going to go through a couple of definitions, actually 3. So we're all talking about the same thing. And first is, what is a native plant? And these are plants that have been growing here for thousands of years. They grow in a particular habitat, such as a wetland, a forest, a meadow, and they're well adapted to the climate, the light, and the soil conditions that characterize their ecosystem. Native plants were here prior to European settlement, and that's an important piece. Native plants have the tremendous advantage of being able to evolve and adapt to evolutionary change at a relatively slow pace. That's genetic diversity. That supported their continued survival for thousands of years, and it's also fostered ecosystem stability. So swamp milkweed, beautiful plant in our marshes, little blue stem, a fabulous native grass that can grow in our meadows, and even plants like Virginia rose are all plants that were here prior to European settlement. Native plants are best for our gardens as they're hardy, they really take less water, and they have important biological interactions with pollinators, such as our native bees, our butterflies, our wasps. There's some beetles. And just to be clear, when I speak of native bees, I'm talking about some small bees, such as our mason bee or our leafcutter bee, even the fuzzy bumblebees. I'm not talking about the non-native honeybee that was brought from Europe in the 1600s to pollinate crops. And the honeybee is very important in the agricultural context, but not so in the ecological context. So our native plants evolved with native pollinators. And many of these pollinators are declining at a critical rate. So we need to do all we can to keep this relationship strong. Okay, next. So then we can look at what is a non-native plant. And these are definitely plants that are in your yard. They're all around us. These are what we call exotics. They're aliens or weeds. And these are plants that have been introduced to an area from their native range. So by 1637, less than 20 years after the Pilgrims had come ashore in New England, seeds of the American sycamore were on their way back to England. They were planted in a London garden. There was already a sycamore from Asia that was there. And eventually these two hybridized. A new species known as a London plane tree came about. And this was then shipped back to America and became a favorite plant in our growing cities. So just to give you an idea of how did we get non-natives here? Many came on ships, but many were introduced. Common plantain on our left. This is one that the Native Americans called the white man's foot because it thrived in the disturbed and damaged ecosystems. This was one that was brought by the Puritans. So they had something familiar. The red clover on the right, this is another one from Europe. Not native, but comes up quite profusely. Queen Anne's lace, they think its origin was in Afghanistan. So lots of movement of these non-native plants. And because non-natives, they grow aggressively, they can quickly overtake the habitat of our native plants. So we'd rather not have them. They're not as good for our pollinators, but they're here. Okay, next. So then we get into an invasive plant. And number one, this is a non-native species. And when it's introduced into an ecosystem where it's not native, it causes or is likely to cause environmental or economic harm or harm to human health. In fact, invasive plants are commonly regarded as the second greatest threat to global biodiversity, and that's next to habitat loss. So that's huge. Kudzu is a plant definitely probably near the top of the invasive list. This was introduced to the US in 1876 at the Centennial Expedition in Philadelphia. This is a plant from Japan, has large leaves, it has sweet smelling blooms, and it quickly became, quickly became a gardener's delight. Everybody wanted it. Even during the Great Depression, the Soil Conservation Service promoted kudzu for erosion control. And it really wasn't until the 1950s that the US government was no longer advocating its use. So we just didn't know. And in fact, it's really probably within the last 30, 40 years that we even have the term invasive. And that's important. This plant soon became known as the plant that ate the South. So if you travel to the South, you just see it growing in these huge mats along the highways. And it's very difficult to eradicate. It has massive tubers. They can weigh up to 40 pounds. They can be 9 feet under the ground, which means with our changing climate, these also now can invade Massachusetts because they're protected underground. And in fact, this has been identified as a plant on the vineyard. It's also had 2 locations in Marblehead. So it's one with our invasive group, it's everybody looking. And if we ever find this plant, we need to eradicate it very quickly. Next, so why are invasives so bad? Number one, they decrease the biological diversity of native ecosystems. They reproduce very fast, and they outcompete and replace our native plants. If we look at the purple loosestrife, looks beautiful planted against this sidewalk here on the left, but when it lets loose into our wetlands, it just becomes this ecological disaster. There's few bees that will pollinate it, and it really provides no ecological resources such as seeds for native wildlife. It doesn't provide nesting habitat, and it takes over all of the habitat of the cattails, all of the arrowheads, and all of our native wetland plants. Luckily, there's now a beetle that was released, a Gilroccello beetle, a European beetle that was released back in 1992, and it has been successful in controlling this plant. We can still see lots of it, but it isn't on our dirty dozen. Again, our non-natives are very aggressive. So, we need to pick our battles. And the biggest piece is, again, identifying the plant quickly in our community. Prevention is key, and it's also least costly. Usually there's a 20 to 40 year lag time by the time these plants get established. We don't really know all the reasons why it takes so long. It may be due to changes in the climate. I know at the sanctuary, we had plants that stayed in the same place, such as black swallowwort, up until really the late 80s, 90s. And then it seemed like it sprouted legs and took off into the fields and even into the woodlands, a plant that you'll be hearing about. The times involved that it takes as far as the lag time are really relative, but the bottom line is by the time, the plant invasions become noticed, in many cases, that proverbial horse has already left the barn and there's less options for eradication. But there's still lots that can be done. But the sooner that we can identify the populations, the better off it is. Next. Okay, so onward to the West Newbury Dirty Dozen. And for all of these, we want them dead. So let's start. Next. Morrow's honeysuckle. This is a plant that we see, and as Nancy and I looked at what are we going to put in for these Dirty Dozen, it's looking at sort of our roadsides, our yards, and our open spaces where we see lots of these Dirty Dozen that we've identified. And Morrow's honeysuckle is certainly one of those plants out there. This was introduced from Japan by a Dr. James Morrow. He was on Commodore Perry's expedition to Japan in 1860, and he actually worked for the State Department. His job was to bring back seeds and plants from Japan. And this is one that really took off over a number of years. You'll see this coming into bloom in May, sometimes into June. It has these white to yellow flowers. It's opposite in its leaves. So leaves are opposite each other, and look underneath, usually very hairy. Lots of berries. It produces these round red berries in pairs. They persist through the summer, and birds will consume the fruit. And birds consuming the fruit then fly to new areas and results in dispersal to new habitats. The problem with most of these non-native fruits is that though they have carbohydrates, they don't provide fat, and birds need fat. The other problem with so many of these non-natives, they don't support our native caterpillars. So birds, to have youngsters, it's not bird seed that's going to get those youngsters out of the nest. They need to have fat caterpillars. And so for a lot of these non-natives, probably most of them, if not all of them, they're not producing the caterpillars that's needed. So we see the decline in the bird species that are affecting nesting around a lot of these non-natives. We also have Tartarian honeysuckle and Amur honeysuckle. The Tartarian has these purplish pink flowers. The Amur has these whitish yellow flowers. These two will hybridize and form a Bell's honeysuckle. The good news is that even though they're difficult to get down to species, just look at their stems. Take off a twig, they're hollow. That's the good news. If it's a native honeysuckle, which rarely find, our natives have a thick stem. They're not hollow. So that's a way to identify them. Okay, next. So on the left is these plants can get huge. And, look at the space that it takes up. And these plants also have what's called a allelopathic chemical, and it inhibits the growth of other plants. I noticed that when we've taken it out of our property here in West Newbury, it doesn't take long for the native gray dogwood to come up in its place. So really good to get rid of it right in your own yard. It can be identified in the wintertime by having this shreddy bark. And, to get rid of it, loppers can be used to cut off the stems. You might have to saw a really tough base, but dig it out and then keep watching to see if it's resprouting and be as aggressive as it is to get it out of your property. There are some wonderful replacements. On the left, we have the American or Fly Honeysuckle. This is a plant that's pollinated by lots of our native bees. Hummingbirds will use it. It produces these beautiful berries, very rich in fats. And there's also another native honeysuckle called the bush honeysuckle that has this capsulate fruit. So these are two that are nice replacements when you get rid of the Morrows. Okay, next. They keep coming. So this is autumn olive. Again, unfortunately, we're seeing this a lot in our open space areas. And a good one, if you have it in your yard, get rid of it. It has these beautiful, fragrant, cream-colored flowers that are in bloom April to May. Look underneath. So the leaves are alternate. They're oval, and they have these silvery scales on the underside. And then usually, starting in August, you'll start seeing the fruit. It starts out brown. It's abundant. Look at this fruit. And in fact, I read that it's edible. So Julie, if you're on still, you can make, and we could have this for the garden club to make some autumn olive tarts. There was a wonderful recipe for this plant. But look at the fruits. They turn a dark red. They're speckled with small silvery dots. Again, eaten by birds. And this is a plant that was highly promoted by our Soil Conservation Service. I found a booklet. It was actually from the 70s, and they were still promoting it. Highly planted because the fruit is good for wildlife. The problem is it takes over the entire, if it's in a meadow, it takes over the entire meadow habitat. Next. So this first one on the left is our Indian Hill, also called the Cherry Hill Reservoir Field. This is off of Indian Hill Street and Moulton Street. And this was a beautiful meadow starting off in June. You can see in the foreground, there's our native milkweed. There were some asters in here. I took this in August. But unfortunately, in the background, it is just filled with this non-native and this aggressive invasive autumn olive. On the right, in the background of this, autumn olive can also have a tree form. This one's about 30 feet high, filled with lots of fruit. The unfortunate thing is that, these meadows are mowed to control invasives. So the problem with continually mowing and mowing and mowing is that we have so many of our native pollinators that need those stems, those hollow stems. A mason bee is only out for about 6 weeks, and then it has already produced pupa that overwinter. So if we're aggressively mowing these meadows, we're also losing a lot of our native pollinators because they get mowed down. Black swallowtail butterflies also overwinter as a pupa. So, a goal would be to go out and manage aggressively this autumn olive, and then be able to have a rotational schedule so we can really keep our native pollinators. On the bottom right, this is a path that is at our Indian Hill meadow. And there's a path that's mowed so people can have recreation, but yet we have habitat on both sides for pollinators through the winter. Autumn olive. This is a plant, again, to just dig out, use the loppers, cut it down to size. It will aggressively resprout. So this is one that, especially for larger plants, again, if it's small, you can probably just keep at it. But if it's a larger plant, it's going to need a chemical such as Brush Be Gone, and that's applied to the freshly cut stumps. And herbicides can be most effective when they're applied later in the growing season. Another similar species to autumn olive is the invasive Russian olive. We haven't seen this one as much, but I'm sure it's here. And instead of just having those dense silvery scales on the undersurface, this has it on both surfaces. it has yellow flowers and yellow fruits, and again, very aggressive. Glossy buckthorn. This is one also that's introduced from Europe and Asia. And I have to say, you know, here are a lot of these plants, again, because they're in the right climate in Europe and Asia to be able to survive our winters. We have just as many American plants that have become invasive in Europe and Asia, such as our black locust. That's one that they wish had never come over. So glossy buckthorn has these little inconspicuous white flowers, 5-petaled, they're in little clusters. But the thing to notice, and these are usually starting probably by late May, even June, are these reddish fruits. And they will take their time, but slowly, usually by August, they turn this deep purple black color. But also look near the stem tips. Because there's flowers that usually persist and they're the last to develop fruit. So kind of a dead giveaway, but that really glossy leaf. The other piece is the bark. It's sort of this gray-brown bark and it's smooth. It has these smooth white lenticels. That's another identification. And these lenticels are used for gas exchange. All plants have them, but some like the glossy buckthorn, they're much more prominent. Next. You know, and again, buckthorn, if you go for a walk in Riverbend, you'll just see lots of it along each side of the trail. And, you know, it was brought over here especially for living fences. And here we see this wall of buckthorn, very effective if you want a living fence, but unfortunately, it's just not a good fruit for wildlife. For wildlife, this one has so much fruit, it's so high, and it's like, eat me, like the candy store. But especially in the fall when birds are migrating, they need to build up a fat layer. And this plant doesn't do it. And it takes over the habitat of our really strong fatty fruits like our native dogwoods. And even, you know, the poison ivy berries are fabulous, really high fatty fruits for the migrating birds. This one, again, is loppers digging it out, a weed wrench to try to get out all of the roots because it can really resprout. And, you know, to really be effective, this is another one that needs a chemical control such as Weed Be Gone, where you cut it down and then apply, being very careful not to get chemicals anywhere else. But this is a one that certainly needs some chemical control in most cases. A similar species to this is the common or European buckthorn. And in fact, how did it get its name buckthorn? Well, it has a bud that looks like hooves, the hooves of a deer. And for the common or European buckthorn, this right between those buds will come the thorn. And common has serrated leaf edges. And the fruit is green throughout the summer and then turns a deep black. Our native, not to mistake it, and again, we highly encourage just to really make sure, again, we'll put up as much identifying things as we need so people really know what the non-native is. Because there are some natives, this would be fabulous if we had all of this black chokeberry. This is a fabulous fruit for birds and other wildlife. But look, it has the fruit is called a drupe. They have longer stems and they hang off the stem and they don't cluster around the stem like the buckthorn. So just a good way to notice the differences in these two species. Okay, onward to multiflora rose. This was certainly named adequately because this one means many flowered. This is a plant that was brought over. It's native to Japan and China. And it was introduced in the US in the 1800s, late 1800s, as rootstock for roses. And it was as rootstock for ornamental roses. So for people who grow roses, the rose bushes need to be budded or grafted onto the rootstock of another plant. And this one is one that they found to be very effective for that in the nurseries. But however it got out, this one is very high in seed production also. And this can produce up to 500,000 seeds yearly. I mean, that's just, I wonder who counted it, but just, whew, that's a lot. The way to identify this rose, if you look at the base of the leaf stalk, there's this leafy green structure. It's called a stipule, and it has these little hairy fringes, thank you, on the margins. So that's a good one to identify it. Again, these multiflora roses can get huge. And if you look at the bottom left, these were planted in many states as crash barriers, especially in the 40s and 50s, along the highway medians. I always think, my gosh, if you crashed into that, you know, how long is it going to take you to get out? What are you going to look like? Because of course it has these, they call them prickles, you can call them thorns or whatever, because boy, they really reach out to grab you. These roses can form these dense thickets, and they quickly outcompete other plants. So you got these multiflora roses. Boy, they you kind of want to leave them alone, but they're really worth eradicating. Next. So what I have found is to lop off what they call the canes, the long shoots, and these can be 15 to 18 feet. When those canes also hit the ground, those can sprout and, you know, continue to root under the ground. So again, this takes a little bit of work, but you can keep lopping it off and then eventually cut the base and dig it out. And if not, it can also use some chemical control. You know, this is a plant that, you know, people will see our mockingbirds on. And mockingbirds from the south, that was a southern bird that was already starting to move north, certainly probably had the benefit of this multiflora rose and could eat all those rose hips. But the mockingbird is here, and we can supplement its diet with our native replacements, such as our pasture rose or our Virginia rose, or these can get big, but certainly not as aggressive. They will also support our pollinators. And one of the things that's great about both of these is that they provide pollen for a number of our native bees. So, you know, plants will, in fact, most plants of our native plants will provide nectar. And that's sort of the reward for a bee to go to that plant. The bee has a variety of ways of getting nectar, goes in, but lots of plants have this wonderful pollen, and that pollen can then be used by certain bees to raise new bees. So they'll take that pollen back to their nest, and they'll either use it to feed a pupa or a young bee. So again, these are our native bees, wonderful native replacements in these roses. All righty, lesser celandine. Boy, this is a plant that I learned about a few years ago. It was beautiful. Saw that in sort of what they call the hill strip, that strip between your yard and the street. And there were a few the first year, and kind of thought, huh, they're kind of pretty, and you know, they were almost metallic yellow, and I don't know, they just kind of disappeared and didn't think a lot about them. And you know, by the third year, it was sort of this mat in the hill strip. And that's exactly what this plant does. On the bottom slide, this spreads by these, it has these little, what they call bulblets, and they're produced in the leaf axils. And then they also have these underground tubers. So this plant was brought over again from Europe as an ornamental plant, but it's very aggressive. And once it gets out, it's very hard, again, to eradicate. This is one that we've seen in wetlands along Georgetown Road and on Crane's Neck. If you look in the ditches, the wet ditches, you'll find lots of this lesser celandine plant. And here on the bottom, when it gets into our woodlands, it just creates a mat. I mean, this will just continue to spread and spread and spread. So, you know, it takes away from our spring beauties, you know, it would take out our bloodroot, our trillium. So it's well worth if this especially starts to get into a woodland to really bring out a team and work to eradicate it, because these native wildflowers are an important source of nectar for our native bees and other insects in early spring. Next. So I've experimented with black plastic. So laid down black plastic until I thought it was gone. And then it's, this is a plant, comes up, it blooms, and then usually within 6 weeks, it just kind of disappears. Again, in the woodland, that would happen if it takes over and then it disappears, it would allow a lot of more non-natives to come in. So this is one that, dig it up, try to remove as many of those tubers as possible and just keep at it until you're successful. And this is one to bag and dispose of all the material in either a landfill. You just don't want it in a compost pile. And again, unfortunately, this is one that is very aggressive. We would need to work with the Conservation Commission because in our wetlands, we need to think about our wetlands protection law to eradicate this, but it certainly is working to outcompete our beautiful marsh marigold. And just on the right, another plant that has the name of Celandine is our greater Celandine. This is a non-native, but it's not considered an invasive plant. And this will come out a little bit later. It's a taller plant, usually a foot, foot and a half. So just if you hear Celandine, lesser and greater. Two different families. Then we have to look at yellow iris. This again was brought to North America as an ornamental for the garden, though it really grows and really does its best in wetlands. And I'm not sure of what garden, but it certainly escaped the garden and made it into wetlands. And any iris that you see that's yellow, it's non-native. There's no native iris species in New England that have yellow flowers. We have our beautiful flag iris, Iris versicolor, and we're lucky to have that here in West Newbury. All through the Ipswich River floodplain, we never found our native blue iris. It was all yellow. This was certainly in the Ipswich River floodplain, and it becomes very aggressive. It has these deep rhizomes or roots, and it really cuts off all the other native plants from seeding in. But again, well worth getting rid of this one. But it's if you have a wetland, it's subject to the Mass Wetlands Protection Act, and work with our Conscom and come up with a plan of how to work to eradicate it. Also, if you're pulling it up, it does have this glycoside that can, when this plant, I should say, when, it's not in flower, it has leaves that look like our native cattails. So back in my Yule Gibbon days, when native cattails were, when they start to come up, they're very edible. But if you mistake it for yellow iris, you'll know really quick, because you'll start to get this tingling sensation in your mouth. So you really want to be careful of not doing that. The other piece is, if you look at the leaf, there's a vein that goes up the leaf of the yellow iris, and it starts to go off to the right. So it doesn't stay on course. So that's one way to identify it. But if you're pulling it up, it can be sappy. That can be an irritant to the skin. So it's one that may require gloves. Next. Okay, so we've gotten rid of all of these non-natives. What are we going to put in? Northern bayberry is a fabulous native shrub. And this is a great one for a number of our songbirds that will eat the fruit. These fruit will stay on late in the season, but this is one a lot of our warblers, like our yellow-rumped warbler, will eat, as well as tree swallows. So a great one to have in your yard. Sweet pepper bush, another one. When the flowers disappear and you have this fabulous, the remaining pod, it looks like peppercorn. So that's how it got its name. but this is a great plant for hummingbirds and butterflies and native bees. It's a beautiful plant and very sweet smelling. And the fruits are eaten by birds. Our dogwoods, such as our red osier dogwood, our alternate leaf dogwood, our gray dogwood, you just can't go wrong. They have beautiful flowers, great for pollinators, and also very fatty fruits. Our viburnums, such as the nannyberry, there's arrowhead viburnum, there's a number of them, fabulous berries, and just wonderful fruit for the birds. So there's a variety of those that can be planted native here in Massachusetts. And then service barrier shadbush. This is one that gets its name because when the shad are running in the rivers in late April, early May, this is one that's in bloom. That's really important for our first pollinators that are coming out in April. So they also need that nectar pollen. And this is a plant that is great value to our native bees. And so even when preparing gardens, it's good to have plants that are blooming really from late April and extending with the asters into the fall. And that is really the greatest benefits. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Carol.
Nancy, is this a good time to interrupt with some questions?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I think that everybody is on mute, but I think you can still hear the questions and the answers. One of the questions that came in was the preferred method of disposal. I noticed on one of the slides you mentioned for the lesser celandine to put it in a bag and put it in a landfill. But what about some of the other ones like the autumn olive, et cetera, et cetera? And what is the risk of trying to take these down and perhaps inadvertently spreading it? So, can you just give us a little bit more information on how to take it out? You said to dig it out, et cetera. And is there any risk with that, with all of these? And then how would we dispose of some of the other ones that you mentioned?
Yeah, so for most of them, what I do is leave them out, and because usually it's sort of in the spring into the summer, and let the seeds dry out. And I haven't noticed any spreading, like with the multiflora rose. Again, with some of them, there's just so much material that it would be a lot to bag up. So I keep it in one place, and then I haven't noticed resprouting from that.
Yeah, and I do know that if you have enough land and you pile it up in a brush pile, like Carol said, let it dry out, and then you can kind of burn it like this time of year when we can get a burning permit. The ones with the fruits, don't move it too far,
Right.
Because you don't want to drop the seeds, but otherwise they won't resprout from the cut stems.
Yeah, like buckthorn. Yeah, if you can just have the one brush pile and keep it there, that's the best.
Okay, thank you. Another question came in because you had mentioned brush begone. Is brush begone safer than Roundup?
So I guess I'll take that. So
Yeah.
I do use brush begone a lot with woody species. So the difference between, there's two differences between Roundup and brush begone. And brush begone, the chemical is triplichlor, if you want to look at the label. Roundup will kill every plant out there. It's what's called a broad, it'll kill grasses, it'll kill these kind of herbaceous plants. And it's what's called a contact herbicide. It means that like you spray it on the leaves, and the leaves absorb the chemical, and then that's when it's most effective. The brush begone is only for plants that, so it won't kill grasses and related like sedges and things like that, but it will kill all broadleaf plants. It seems to work a little bit better with woody species, and it's the way they act. So brush begone, when it's sprayed, you can spray on a cut stem, or with smaller plants, you can actually just spray on the stem itself without killing the actual plant. And it goes down into the roots, and it kills the plant, the roots, and then the plant dies. So it just acts a little bit differently. And for woody species, and because it won't kill grasses and associated plants, it's one that I prefer to use.
Okay. A question came in, is chokeberry another name for choke cherry?
They're two different species. The one is an aronia. They're closely related, but they are two different species.
Okay, and can you talk about poison ivy? It's
Yeah.
native, but yet it's considered invasive. Is that correct?
Well, you know, no, I wouldn't call poison ivy invasive. I mean, certainly it will take off. It's a vine. And poison ivy, it wants to climb because it wants to get to the sun. You know, it starts off right down there at the bottom, and it will use other plants. It will use our poles along the street. And you'll see those filled with poison ivy. And so it's very effective. You know, if there's dead trees, it will go up the dead trees and getting to the top. And that's where it has its flowers and its berries. So, you know, if it's in your yard, you know, certainly, and you get rid of it. If it's in an area where people are going to be, but if there's places that you can allow it, and especially in our open spaces, if we can allow it, it's not along our paths. Fabulous plant for birds. Fabulous.
And I will be talking about a couple vines and how to control them, and poison ivy, you can use the same technique. So I'll cover poison ivy when I go over that.
Okay, great, thank you. Yellow iris, a question came in on the yellow iris. It seems to have come out of nowhere very quickly. So where did it come from? How did it get here?
It was brought here as an ornamental plant, and it's really one that's been here for well over 100 years. But you know, that's again what we don't know. When we have non-natives, we just don't know what's the trigger that they become very noticeable. So again, because it's an ornamental plant, you know, if somebody thinks it's beautiful and brings it in, and then somehow it gets moved, we then see it moving into and becoming aggressive in our wetlands.
Okay, and the next two questions you may answer later on in your presentation, but I will just throw them out there so that you can be thinking of them. And the question came in is, any suggestions on where I can get native plants? And another one that was similar to that is, where can we get some good native species to plant on steep slopes where erosion is a concern? So I know that, I think later on you're going to be talking more about natives, correct?
We certainly will have some resources. We have
Okay.
a list of resources for folks and where to buy native plants.
Okay, great.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, so I'll leave that. And then another question came in on, can you use some kind of copper treatment to kill the buckthorn?
I don't know. Nancy, I don't know.
I'm not sure either. I mean, there is a little bit of out competing, but the reason why a lot of these plants are invasive is because they are very, very aggressive. So you can definitely try it. I think buckthorn, as with a lot of the shrub, invasive shrubs, when you cut it, the closer you cut to the ground, the less likely it is to not resprout.
Yeah, I would agree.
You know, cut it like less than an inch. And I think buckthorn, if you cut it at the ground, it might not resprout. You might not even have to use the chemicals.
Oh, okay. A couple of other questions. One says, what about the lovely heart-shaped ivy? It's incredibly invasive.
The English ivy?
Oh yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. If you can get rid of it, get rid of it. But you know, yeah, I know
Okay.
there's quite a number of invasives. So
Yeah, there are. And I know you're talking more about native invasives than like English ivy. But another question came in is, I would be interested in knowing how to get rid of bittersweet, Pachysandra, creeping Charlie, pokeberry.
I will talk about bittersweet. Pokeberry, that's a native, right?
Yeah.
Right. I guess you can pull it, but it
Sure.
is native, and it's I know some people think that it's poisonous to humans. I guess if it's raw and you eat it, but it's actually a really good wildlife food, and it is on the edible list, so, edible plant list, believe it or not. So it is a nice plant to have. What were some of the others?
Bittersweet, you're going to talk about bittersweet later.
We should keep going.
Pachysandra,
Yeah.
Creeping Charlie. Are they considered invasives or?
They're non-natives. I mean, Creeping Charlie's a non-native.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the plantain that you just have to be very aggressive in getting rid of it. And that's a problem with the non-natives, is like they can keep coming back and coming back. So,
Right.
but we really don't see it as aggressive in our open spaces.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of the invasive plants we are talking about, they've already escaped the garden, and they are like taking over on their own. So you will find some of these ground covers in old homesteads.
Yeah.
And you know, they're probably difficult to control, but they haven't gone to the stage, as Carol said, where they are producing on their own and spreading on their own outside of where they're planted. But I think one thing to be aware is, you know, we all want plants that are low maintenance and disease free, and those are the same characteristics that make them invasive. So if you are looking for those plants, if you could choose native, then you'll be sure that they won't become invasive in 20, 30 years.
That's right.
Oh, great. Thank you. Okay, that's all the questions I have now. So please continue. Great presentation.
Okay.
You've gotten some great compliments.
So yeah, that was a lot of good information, and that's only 6 of our species. So I got 6 more, but I'm going to go a little faster.
Yeah.
Because Carol's talked a lot about control methods, and a lot of the control methods are the same.
Yes.
So I have 2 invasive shrub species on my list. Burning bush or winged euonymus is one of them. The easiest way to identify them is by these stems that almost have like little ridges on them. They're kind of little wings coming off. They're kind of a beautiful plant, but very invasive. If you go to Mill Pond, you'll see them all over kind of the understory there. They do have this lovely fall color, but a lot of our native shrubs also have that color. The red Aussie Dogwood is one that has beautiful red stems. So there are native alternatives if you are looking for that. It has opposite leaves, as Carol has mentioned. So opposite leaves are what the 2 leaves come out at the same point, whereas if it was alternate, they come out at different points. But the stem, I find, is the easiest way to identify this plant. Another one that is also red in the fall is Japanese barberry. There's also a common barberry, but the Japanese seems to be the more common one. These almost have like the leaves, tear-shaped leaves, come out in like whorls. I actually think it's a very pretty plant. It's very pretty flowers, but the flowers are very small. And then they do have this red drupe, red berry that is edible. That kind of looks like a little goji berry to me. But when they escape, this is taken at Mill Pond, and it has thorns, so it also makes it very difficult to enjoy nature when they take over a habitat like this. So as Carol has kind of mentioned with a few of her plants, most of the woody shrubs you treat the same way, which is nice because you don't have to remember different method for different. So if it's a woody shrub you're trying to get rid of, you could pour it out. This is a weed wrench that this woman is using, and it just gives you a little bit more leverage because the roots are deep and you can't just pour it out. And that is pretty effective if you can pour it out, because you're getting out probably 90% of the roots. So it's less likely to resprout. If you cannot pour it out, you can either cut it with a lopper or a saw or a machete. You can girdle it. So basically what you want to do is break the skin all the way around. And some of the invasive shrubs will resprout when you do that. So in order to prevent it from sprouting, like I said, cut it at the ground or you can take a bottle of Bush Begone that you can buy at Home Depot or your favorite agway, and just kind of give it a quick squirt. You don't need a lot of chemical. So onto vines. Asian bittersweet. This one is, there's a lot around town. I'm sure you've noticed in the last, in November and December, they have these kind of yellow fruit that bursts open. And then you have this really pretty, actually red and yellow cluster of fruit. And their leaves are kind of heart-shaped. You can see them really well this time of year. If you come across a tree and it has a thick vine twining around it, and if it's not hairy, it's probably Asiatic bittersweet. If it's hairy, it's probably poison ivy. Another one that I really was hoping was not invasive. I planted this at my last house in Amesbury, thinking, oh, I haven't really seen it being invasive. It's not really in this area. And then I ended up pulling it out because it went under my deck and started popping up all over my garden. But that is an actual vine around a tree. So you can see how big it gets, and it will actually choke the tree and kill it. This picture down here was taken at a refuge in New Hampshire, over in Newington, and the whole forest is purple. It smells really good, but not very good for the wildlife or the habitat. So definitely one. It's not escaped in West Newbury that I've seen it. I don't know if anybody else has seen it, but if you do have it in your garden, you might want to consider whether or not it will escape your garden. So keep a close eye on it if you don't take it out. So woody vines, woody vines are actually one of the easier ones to control. All you have to do is cut it close to the ground. So this is actually, I think this is poison ivy. You can see it's a little bit hairy. You can cut it once, but to be safe, you can cut it in 2 places and leave a gap, because sometimes if you cut it, they will heal and grow back together. It hasn't happened much, but and then when you cut it, everything that's above your cut, you're good. It's gonna die off. Don't worry about it. You can come back and pull it off if it's not poison ivy and burn it, or you can just leave it. It'll just drop off. And then the bottom, if you want, again, you can spray it with, Bush Begone or some chemical, and that will kill the roots. So it's less likely to come back the next year. Sometimes if a tree has a lot of vines, it's really hard to see where all the vines are. So what I'll do is I'll do a cut and I'll come back a month later and see what's still alive above. And then I just follow it down and cut, the vine that's still alive. And typically around a tree within a year, and definitely within 2, I can control most of the vines I want to get rid of, including poison ivy. If the vines are too big for loppers, which is the case in some situations, I just bought myself a folding saw, and it works beautifully. You can cut through almost anything. So same thing, you just cut through the vine, and you can kill the plant above that, and just have to deal with the roots and any resprouts that comes out if you don't want to use herbicides.
Nancy, because we're talking about poison ivy, does it actually harm a tree?
Poison ivy is less likely to harm a tree. It definitely stresses it. It won't kill it. Some of the others, I think bittersweet, wisteria, the mild minute that Carol talked about earlier, those will completely choke a tree because it will completely cover it. But yeah, the Virginia creeper, which is another native vine, and the poison ivy won't really kill a tree.
So, and how would you dispose of poison ivy?
Oh, that's tough. I usually just let it be. I used to be not allergic, and last couple years ago, I did become allergic, mostly trying to get rid of poison ivy in my yard. I just touch it as little as possible and then just leave it be. I don't find the dead stems eventually will come off on their own, the more it dries out. if you want, you can put on gloves or grabbers and pull it out. Definitely don't burn poison ivy. Make sure that does not end up in your burn pile and that you don't accidentally throw a stem that's poison ivy in your burn pile, because that chemical, when it burns, you will breathe it in and it will actually irritate your lungs from the inside. So if you're getting rid of it, make sure you don't burn it.
Yeah, because you could bag it, right? And
You
throw
can
it in.
bag it. Yeah, I usually just leave it kind of, in the corner somewhere, let it decompose.
Okay, a couple more questions came in. Let me just check these. No, okay, they were basically, can we burn poison ivy? Okay, we're all set.
Okay, so another one that is actually relatively new to West Newbury and relatively new to the area, though it sounds like, Carol, there's a lot in Ipswich,
Right.
is black swallowwort. It's another vine. It's actually kind of a delicate vine. And it's really hard to see except when it gets its pods. It gets these pods in July and August, and that's when it's really the most visible. It is in the milkweed family, and monarch butterflies will actually lay their eggs on this plant because it is a milkweed. Unfortunately, it's toxic to the caterpillar. So any caterpillar that gets laid on this plant will die. So it's kind of a trap for monarch. So I only know of one location in town that has black swallowwort, and that's right behind the annex building in town. So we pulled it last year, and I stopped by this year and pulled a few plants. It looked like there's a lot less. I like to continue pulling that site, and also wanting kind of a educational campaign. If anybody is seeing that, this is an early detection plan, and we want to keep it out of our town, because we have a field at my refuge in New Hampshire where it's taken over about 10 acres. In 10 years, it went from one plant to 10 acres of fields completely covered in this black swallowwort. And they're very, very difficult to control once they establish. So the time to control is when they first come in. And I think this is our last one, is Japanese knotweed, which is another plant that, is newer in town. If you're driving the roads between Newburyport and West Newbury, if you pay attention, you'll notice that the knotweed stands are huge in Newburyport, and then you cross into the West Newbury line, and the spots are smaller, but they're beginning to spread in town. So this is, it's also called Japanese bamboo because the stalks appear woody, but they're not. And they have these joints like bamboo. They have these white flowers that for many, many years we thought were infertile, and they tested infertile for many, many years. But again, as Carol said, some of these plants are introduced and they sit there and they're not as invasive. This is a plant where the seeds used to be infertile. And now that they've established themselves and adapted to our climate, the seeds have become fertile and they've become viable. So this is a plan that we're hoping to do some testing and hope to start treating around town. And there's a couple of people in our committee that's working with the DPW in trying to get a program going. So Japanese knotweed, if you are interested in treating it on your street or in your yard, if you want to do only mechanical, you want to just repeat. So you want to cut it at least 4 times during the growing season. Try to dig out the roots if you can. We've also heard that shading with thick plastic and mulch over many years do seem to work. There's kind of some anecdotal stories that some people had some success in town. So we're going to try to track that down and share that if you don't want to use chemicals. With herbicides, typically the best way is to cut 1 to 2 times early in the season. And then in August, you can spray it when they're about 3 feet tall. And they'll get you about 90% control, and you just want to follow up the following year. At work, I did try stem injection for 1 spot, and that did work really well. it's also very, very intensive.
Yeah.
So if anyone want to talk about that, we can talk more about that in the question and answer session. One thing about knotweed is that it tends to grow near water, especially in the floodplains. So if your stand is near water, don't leave it right there, because the tide will come in and it'll wash out, and these will resprout and recolonize somewhere else. Otherwise, you can leave it. You know, if your site is in the uplands or in an area where it's not going to get flooded, it's fine to leave it, because it's a lot of material.
Can you mow Japanese knotwood, or will that cause it to create new plants? Do you know?
Weed whacking is probably the best way. If you mow it, the concern is that if you take that mower somewhere else, you will spread the plant. So if you mow it, make sure you wash your mower down before you take it somewhere else.
So that little pieces, you know, even if you weed whack it, can little pieces fly off and create new plants?
It could, but I don't think they will spread that far. Right. But knotweed is definitely one that it's along both sides, because the mower spread it. So, okay. Yeah. So one of the reasons, as I mentioned, that, you know, we're so we all care about invasives. I mean, nobody really likes invasives, right? We're all passionate about invasives because in our town of West Newbury, we still have a lot of native open space and wild habitats. Almost 30% of our town is protected, and a lot of it is protected on private land. So we still have a lot of really rare habitat. We still have a lot of the native shrubs that Carol talked about. Here's some pictures of, and if you walk down the street, you can see this is actually common, you know, and that's not the case in the adjacent towns. You don't typically see these understory shrub plants in the adjacent towns, and it's because West Newbury still is intact and it still is wild. There's also a lot of wildflowers that is still in town. Again, without that invasive kind of understory, the light is able to penetrate on forests and support a lot of these native flowers. So this is one of the reasons why we're kind of enthusiastic in trying to get a town-wide program started to start tackling some of our invasives. So I'm gonna, I don't know if there's any questions, Jane, go ahead and ask them, but I'm gonna shift here.
Yeah, a question just came in about if you cut bittersweet vines now during the winter, when should I treat the cut roots with brush begone?
You can treat it now.
No, okay.
And with the cut stem application, whether it's a vine or a shrub, you actually want to do it as soon as possible after you cut, because within a few hours, because the plant will actually heal over, and then the chemical won't be as effective. Okay. But that's one of the nice things about the brush begone versus a rodeo, is that you can use it during the dormant season, because it will get absorbed and down into the roots.
Okay, thank you.
So the working group, we've kind of had a couple meetings, and we have a lot of ideas. So I've kind of tried to capture these into a couple of different categories, and I'll share them, but we're open to new ideas as well. So one of the categories is kind of controlling invasive plants and maybe mapping some types of invasive plants in town. So I already talked about Japanese knotweed. One of our committee members has mapped the Japanese knotweed in town, and this is the map he created. And we've identified about 4 or 5 of these stands that we want to treat in the coming years. Probably with some grant funding. Black swallowwort, I already mentioned. Carol also mentioned working on town-owned lands, and she gave the example of Cherry Hill. Riverbend behind the Page School is another area that came up on our committees, an area that, you know, we really want to do some work in the town-owned public spaces so that we keep some of these wild areas native. And then there is a lot of private large parcels in town. You know, a lot of people own pretty large parcels that can do a lot of work. And even, you know, most parcels are 2 acres in West Newbury, and you can do a lot of good on 2 acres, you know, or 1 acre. So we definitely want to also reach out to private landowners and have them be part of the solution. We are just starting conversations about an internship program. We have a lot of enthusiastic volunteers, but they're all very busy with many other things that they're doing. So we thought that it would be a good opportunity to get the young folks in town a chance to make a difference in conservation. So we're going to try to get an article together for the annual town meeting this year with a line budget item for internship program. So please be on the lookout for that, and we would love your support for that as well, obviously. Outreach and education is a very large part of this working group. Like I said, because so much of the invasives are going to be on private land, and we need a lot of help. But invasive control and mapping is just a part of it, but we will be putting out information and kind of similar to this presentation, but how do you do it if you're interested in doing it on your own land? Carol and some of the others are very passionate about natives and pollinators. And I think there's also a lot of experience out there amongst you guys about what kind of, I think a lot of people have tested different natives, different pollinator plants. So we definitely want to get input from you guys and what worked and what didn't. There's been discussion and interest about other green landscaping practices like composting, rain gardens, and such. We're talking about doing more presentations and guided walks when we can do it safely. In the garden club, I know specifically there's been a few conversations about like starting a kind of ask a gardener, a garden expert program. I think we had initially talked about, you know, helping people identify the cultivars that's in their garden. But maybe we can expand that to include natives and invasives, you know, how to do a consultation program to come and help people figure out what to do with their backyard or their land. There's a lot of interest in developing a demonstration garden in town. Specifically, we've talked about one in Mill Pond. There's a really good opportunity there. And then John Terry with the Gulf of Maine Institute, who gave the presentation in December or November, is starting a new effort to start a string of sanctuary gardens along the Merrimack River from Bethlehem, New Hampshire, all the way down to Newburyport. So he has he wants to look into opportunities of working with the 2 schools, Page School and Pawtucket School here in town, and see if we can get a sanctuary garden started with the schools and the students at the schools. Carol, do you have anything to add to this list?
No, that's perfect. No.
But again, you know, we really need your help. We're hoping that this is kind of just an introduction to this and that we start the discussion and the ideas going. We want you to be, you know, controlling invasives in your yard using natives. And if you have done everything in your yard, maybe you want to help your neighbors or go down the street and start taking those clippers down the street or your favorite trail. And again, I feel like, you know, just talking to people around town, especially the people in the garden club, there is so much knowledge that you all have, and we really want to get some of those success stories and try to document that and share them so that, you know, other people can learn from your successes. So we would love it if you can join us. Our group, what we started as the Invasive Working Group, we're kind of toying with the new title of West Newbury Native and Wild, because really that's why we're doing it. I have this Google form, which I will copy that link into the chat box when I finish my presentation. But It's just a couple questions. It should take you less than 5 minutes. We kind of want to know if you want to help, like what you can bring, what you're interested in, but also what do you want to hear from the group in terms of presentations and resources? What would help you, do the work wherever you're interested in doing it.
Yep.
And then I
Okay.
will.
Nancy, can I interrupt you at this point just for a few more questions before you close?
Yes.
Okay. This gets down, again, we're talking about getting rid of invasives, is small winged euonymus is easy to pull up, but will residual roots still sprout?
They might. And I would say that if it has seeds, the seeds will probably germinate. So, with a lot of these invasives, whether or not you use herbicides, but especially if you don't, it will take some repeated treatments over multiple years. So, but you can get a lot of it by, getting started. You definitely see smaller amounts, and the seedlings that come up will be a lot easier to treat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what would you recommend is the best way to get rid of lesser celandine?
Honestly, I'm still working on it. I'm trying the black plastic. We laid down black plastic last year to see, for 6 weeks. And we also aggressively dug out the bulblets. So, and this is on sort of this area between the yard and the road. So stay tuned. But I would, dig it out, and just keep attacking it.
Keep attacking it. I think with a lot of the invasives, that's what you have to do. But is butterfly bush considered an invasive?
I don't think it's made an invasive list yet. Again, the problem with this plant, you can see lots of butterflies on it, but, and it takes up a lot of room, and it's not what we call a host plant. So a butterfly is not going to lay its eggs on butterfly bush. And that's the problem with it. It's a non-native, it was not here prior to the Europeans coming to North America. So, again, the problem with this plant too is that we're seeing more of it escaping. It definitely is sort of leaving the yard and kind of moving into the woodland and the edges of woodland. So it's one to be very careful with.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other alternatives like bees balm, which is not a shrub but a perennial, is one that's really good for pollinators, and it's easy to control. If you just dig it up and it won't come back.
Okay, there was another comment here that says, what about a Facebook page to allow people to share questions and pictures to inform people and experiences in their town and throughout the town? Do you have a Facebook page?
Not yet, but that's a great idea.
We'll put it on the list.
Okay, and somebody else wrote in and said, be mindful of hogweed, which was brought in from China as an ornamental. If you encounter it, the fluid from the hogweed causes third-degree burns. There's a giant hogweed hotline in Massachusetts. They will come remove it, so it is dangerous.
Right.
Can you say anything more about hogweed?
I don't know I know very little about it. I've read about it. I haven't seen it myself, but again, when we look at invasives where they can cause problems to human health, this is one, because it's very toxic if you touch it, and it can get huge. I mean, this is a very large 4 to 6 foot plant.
Yeah.
But
I do not have. I don't know of it.
Yeah, and I haven't seen it on the North Shore. I did get 2 reports of it, and I went out and looked at them, and they were the giant angelica, which is a native big plant that looks like it, but is not exactly it. But as you said, the Department of Ag actually has like a poster on how to tell the difference between the two. But yeah,
Mhm.
definitely.
Okay.
If you think you have it, better to report it.
Okay. What, I think you answered this, Nancy, but just to reiterate the question is, what would be a good alternative to butterfly bush? You had mentioned bee balm.
Oh, any of the viburnums. I mean, those would be wonderful that they visit. Any of our native dogwood would be wonderful alternatives.
Yeah, I'm not sure if
Um,
this is completely
have to think
native,
about it.
but spirea, like I have a spirea bush in my front, and the bees and the butterflies are constantly around it, and it blooms all summer long. My neighbor's honeybees love it.
You know what other one's a really great one is the St. John's wort. That's a huge pollinator plant.
Okay.
And there is a native there's two native spirea. There's the
Mhm.
they're called meadowsweet, I think.
Meadowsweet.
Spirea, alba,
And
spirea,
tomentosa.
tomentosa, and they do. I think this alba is
Steeplebush.
beautiful. Yeah,
Steeplebush. Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
one.
yeah.
Okay. Another question came in. Can you quickly address eradicating bamboo? You might quickly address it, but I don't think you can eradicate it quickly.
Japanese, Maui, or bamboo?
It just says eradicating bamboo. So.
So bamboo is and will be invasive. That's another one I really wanted to plant in my yard, and after as much research, I was like, yeah, no. That's a hard one. You know, dig it up as much as you can if it's small, but you got to really make sure that you have all the roots. I've seen websites where people like basically enclosed the entire bamboo, like dug a trench and like lined it, and they still got out. And as our climate gets warmer, it will definitely become more invasives, because it is invasive in New York. It's very invasive in the Carolinas, that further down south. So as you know, we're gonna get warmer, and the bamboo and a lot of these invasive plants will become more invasive.
More invasive. And another question, can commercial landscape equipment spread invasives from one place to another?
Definitely possible.
Yeah.
I think if they're mowing invasives, hopefully they are taking good precautions and getting rid of soils and, you know, like washing them down with a power washer.
Okay. Let me see, there's a couple, let me see if there's any more. I think that's the last question I have. And I know, Nancy, that you had a bunch of resources on a slide, but that slide has disappeared. Can you put that slide back up?
Yes, I can do that.
And maybe run over that so everybody has a chance to see it?
Yeah, so hold on, that didn't work. Let me try again.
Okay.
Make sure that Linda has your email, because we will be sending this out. This is not actually the entire list, because, oh, sorry. Here we go. I'm having trouble. Okay, here we go.
Okay, great. Okay, so you are going to send the entire all the slide presentations out to everyone then?
Yes, yeah. So
Great.
I had to cut the resources down a little.
Well, I think we were just going to send this out, right? I mean, people can get the slides if they want, but we'll definitely send out the resources.
Okay. A question came in, and there seems to be some interest in if you would make the slides available to
Sure.
everyone.
Yeah, I think I can. Yeah, we do that probably later. But yeah, make sure Linda has your email, and if she doesn't, go ahead and type it into the chat. I did make it Jane, so that people can chat everyone right now.
Okay, great. So you would like people then to go into their chat and answer your Google questionnaire, correct?
I will post it in a minute. So
Okay.
Carol, I don't know if you want to touch on any of them. I guess somebody asked where they can buy natives, and luckily, there is a lot of resources right now for that. Some of my favorite, I think most of you might already know the Mona gardener. She's out of Ipswich. She doesn't have a lot, but the stuff she does have is really good and they go fast. You can go to her website and get on her email, and the morning of, she will say, I will be in this location with plants to sell, and they usually sell out in like 2 hours. New Hampshire State Nursery, I think they just closed, but they make theirs available, and they're really, really cheap. If you want shrubs, native shrubs, like you can get like 25 shrubs for $15.
Yeah, I just ordered some. All of the yeah, they have this huge site, so they're all native grown. They're 2-year-old seedlings. They have terrific, all of the native dogwoods. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So start ordering now, and then they'll ship in late April, May.
April, yeah. They don't look like much when they arrive. They look like little twigs, but give it 4 years. Like all the native shrubs in my garden were little twigs just 4 or 5 years ago, and they're like 6 feet tall now and huge. And I'm needing to dig it up and give some away.
Okay. What was that site again?
It's right here, the New Hampshire State Forest Nursery.
Oh, okay. So I guess they're just reading down where to buy native plants and seeds.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then a couple of my other favorites. There's 2 in Western Mass. The Sami Farm is New England Wildflowers Nursery. And they have a list. They're a little bit more expensive, but they have beautiful variety, and the plants that you get from them, will be very, very healthy. The Northeast Wetland Plants is another one in Amherst, and they sell a lot of native seeds, but as well as native plugs in the spring. We're actually talking about bringing some in for our garden club sale this year, potentially. So come to the garden club sale. We might have a native section. And then one of my kind of favorites is Feco out of Maine. Again, they only sell plants, whether it's for your garden or natives, that have been germinated and propagated in Maine. So they will do really well here in Massachusetts. And they have an increasing native selection.
Good.
Okay. Well, excellent. I don't see any other questions coming in. So I do want to thank both of you for this very, very enlightening and informative presentation. And thank you very much on behalf of West Newbury Garden Club. And on behalf of the Garden Club, I would like to thank all of our guests, and I invite you to join the Garden Club. And you can find more information about who we are and what we do by going to our website, which is the WNGC, West Newbury Garden Club.org. And as Nancy has said, we were unable to have a plant sale last year, but we will be having a plant sale this year. And we do hope to be able to showcase some native plants for you. And we hope to see you there, because as you know, your support is so instrumental in allowing us to have a scholarship, which we give to students in the Pentucket School District. And we will be having a scholarship again this year, even though we didn't have a plant last year. And if you have or know of anybody who is eligible for the scholarship, which would be a senior at Pentucket or even a college student, please go to, again, our website, because more information will be forthcoming on our scholarship. And with that, I have nothing else. If anybody has anything else they would like to say, I think you can unmute yourself, but in the meantime, I would like to, again, thank Carol and Nancy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Jane, I put the link to the survey in the chat, and I'm putting a shorter link in the chat. It goes to the same place. Okay,
so I will not end this meeting. I will leave the meeting open so that we can get, can you just click on this right now, Nancy, and answer the questions or whatever? Let me try it.
I just put the link on, and I think if anybody wants to stay on, we can stop recording, but you guys can unmute yourself now if you have
any questions. Yeah.
Thank you for a very informative session.
Thank you.
Was great. Nice to see you, Barbara. Yep.
I see Don.
Yeah, I think it went really well, you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Good.
Yeah,
Good job. And I like the idea of sending out the slides to people
yeah.
so that they have a visual in addition to the information. Like the buckthorn or something. I want to go out and check some of my plants.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll-
and also would be nice is if when the weather improves, if you had mentioned this in your presentation during some walking tours to really show us what the plants are.
Yeah, yeah. So Linda, I'll convert the slides into like a PDF and
Okay.
I'll.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I'll pray. I won't do it tonight. Obviously, it's getting late, but with what you sent to me this morning or yesterday, you know, I'll put everything together and send it out to everybody who signed up for this.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, great.
Okay, well, thank you, ladies.
All right.
Okay, well, thank you. I
Bye,
will
everyone.
end, I am now going to end this Zoom.